My name is Dave Winter, and I'm your executive director here at Capital Land Trust. For those of you that might be new to us, Capital Land Trust is part of a network of land trusts that are in every state in the country. And we specifically work to conserve vital natural areas and working lands in the South Puget Sound and Chehalis Basin watersheds, both for their ecological and for their community benefits. This work involves many partners, a lot of community members like yourself, community organizations such as the Puget Sound Estuarium and many others. And let me bounce back one more slide here. But tonight we want to highlight and thank many of our business partners. These businesses are active members of our community, and they help us create a future for our region in which nature and community thrive. So these are some partners that have been with us for a long time, and we truly appreciate their support and their annual commitment to local land conservation. So it's a big part of what we do, and want to highlight these partners, thank them for everything they do to support our work. So our current 5-year strategic plan prioritizes our efforts to protect South Puget Sound estuaries, wetlands, prairies, forest lands, and farms. Over the last couple of years, having to socially distance, we've realized how important time in nature is for our sense of well-being. And we know more deeply now than ever before that healthy communities require healthy, life-supporting local natural areas. It's with this refined focus that Capital Land Trust works to ensure that there are places to experience and connect with nature for all of us in the long term. And I also see what we're doing this afternoon, this virtual conservation conversation, as one of the silver linings that has come out of the last few years. These virtual conversations are one way for us to connect with each other, and for many of you to be right in your own living room, learning more about the values of conservation. Today's program highlights beavers, and we are very fortunate today to have Ben Goldfarb with us and joining us this afternoon. Ben's going to discuss the history of this world-changing species and how beavers can help us fight drought, flooding, wildfire, and climate change, and how we can coexist with this challenging but vital rodent. So Ben, extremely grateful that you're here with us today. Thanks for taking time out of your schedule to join us and share your knowledge. And I'm going to hand over the screen to you and let you take it away.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you so much, Dave, for that introduction. Can you guys hear me okay? Okay, awesome. Yeah, so I'm really honored to be speaking with you all today. Hope you're doing well. I enjoyed reading about your fall activities. These days I live down in Colorado, but I lived in Seattle and then Spokane up until last year for many years. So always fun to talk to a group of Washingtonians, especially given that Washington has some of the best and most progressive beaver laws and regulations in the country, and we'll talk about those in a second. So tonight I'll be talking a lot about working with beavers as conservation partners. How can we sort of engage with these animals to make the world a better place? Before we sort of get into how we can use beavers, I think it's important to establish a few basic beaver facts about what these critters are. Beavers, of course, are rodents, as I'm sure you all know. They are North America's largest rodent. Typically 50 to 60 pounds as an adult beaver. So I think they're quite a bit bigger than people realize. Sort of like icebergs. They've got most of their mass concealed underwater, and they're semi-aquatic rodents, which means they spend pretty much all of their lives in and around water. They've got a few wonderful adaptations for this unique semi-aquatic niche they fill. They've got incredibly dense fur, which of course was their downfall, this really lush pelt, and we'll talk about that in a minute. They've got these wonderful webbed duck-like hind feet. They're very powerful, agile swimmers. They've got a second set of transparent eyelids, which function as goggles called nictitating membranes, as well as a second set of lips, kind of like a valve behind their front teeth, so they can chew and drag branches underwater. I think that's my favorite beaver adaptation. And then, of course, the most recognizable beaver feature, the thing that makes a beaver, is that tail, right? The tail is sort of like a Swiss Army knife. It has a bunch of different functions. It's a rudder while they swim. It's a kind of a kickstand out on land, and they actually put on fat for the winter in their tails. Like a bear adding fat for the winter, and it's an alarm system. I'm sure most of you have heard the smack of a beaver's tail striking the water to warn other beavers about the presence of predators. And if you hear that sound, you're probably the predator that they're worried about. And then the other great beaver feature are those teeth. You can see the top and bottom incisors are kind of self-sharpening, and the teeth are orange, as you can see there. And that's because they're actually sort of chemically and structurally fortified with iron that beavers derive from their food. And it's a good thing they've got very durable iron reinforced teeth, because they spend most of their life chewing. Beavers eat cambium, that's the inner bark of trees. That's kind of the sugary layer that does the growing. Preferred beaver food trees, aspen, cottonwood, willow, anything in the poplar family they're really into. They'll eat pretty much any deciduous tree. They do tend to avoid conifers, although you see them take western red cedar sometimes in western Washington. And they eat lots of, sort of green herbaceous stuff too, cattails and water lilies and various aquatic plants. I've seen them basically mow people's lawns for them. So they've got these really diverse diets, but they are totally herbivorous. They don't eat fish at all. So in addition to felling trees to eat that cambium, that inner bark, beavers, of course, also use the wood as construction material. And there are two basic types of beaver structures. The first is the lodge, which I'm sure most of you have seen at some point. That's kind of the fundamental beaver housing unit. You can sort of see in this picture that there are underwater tunnels that lead up into the lodge, and then in there's a nice kind of elevated nesting chamber. Typical beaver colony or family has 2 to as many as 8 or so members, and that's typically the male and female, the monogamous mating pair, and then the newborn kits, the baby beavers, the 1-year-olds and the 2-year-olds. So you get 3 year classes of brothers and sisters, all kind of cohabitating together at various times. And then those 2-year-olds will disperse out, like teenagers heading off for college, trying to find their own territories. And the second type of beaver structure, of course, which I'm sure you've all seen, is the beaver dam. Here's a nice one. This is just outside of Seattle, kind of near Everett. So what do beavers build dams? Why go to all of this trouble of, creating this kind of elaborate structure of wood and rock and mud, which nothing else in the animal kingdom really, really does? What's the point of the dam? Well, a beaver out on land is kind of this big, fat, slow, smelly package of meat, and they get eaten by all kinds of sharp-toothed critters, cougars, black bears, coyote will take a young beaver, and especially wolves. Wolves love beavers, and now of course there are wolves in Washington State, maybe in Western Washington sometime soon. Here's hoping. We're going to reintroduce wolves down in Colorado at the end of 2023. So increasingly, wolves are back on the landscape, and that's a predator that beavers have to think about. So by building that dam and creating that nice deep pond, instead of having to walk overland to that good-looking aspen tree and probably get eaten by a wolf or a cougar on the way, now they can swim up to that tree instead, fell the tree, float it back down to their pond, raise the height of that water to submerge those lodge entrances, and basically be safe. So it's, the point of the dam is to create that nice deep pond and kind of maximize their own food and shelter. And dams get all kinds of different shapes and sizes. Beaver colonies are, building sometimes as many as, 15 or 20 dams. Usually there's one big primary dam and then a number of smaller secondary dams. I should mention, of course, that beavers, right, they're, very happy living in nice deep bodies of water where they don't need a dam, right? There are plenty of dams in the Columbia River, or plenty of beavers. There are plenty of dams, but there are plenty of beavers in the Columbia River, and of course, they're not damming up the Columbia. They left that to the Army Corps of Engineers. They're just building dams in those kind of higher order streams where they need that water depth to be safe. So you get lots of beavers living in big lakes and rivers, and they're totally happy and probably even happier doing that. But in these smaller streams, they do need to build dams to have the water depth that they need to survive. So here's a nice little dam that's probably 3 feet wide and 1 foot high. And here's a more impressive specimen that's probably the work of many generations of beavers, all adding their stick to the pile. So these structures, when left to their own devices, they can build some pretty incredible things. And they're also, of course, some of these large dams are impounding huge volumes of water, right? I'm always impressed by their hydrologic savvy. I often feel like if you told an Army Corps engineer to build a dam in the spot that, minimizes labor and maximizes total impoundment, they'd put it in the exact same little, outflow areas, little constrictions that beavers use. So here's probably 300 acres of water backed up by a single well-placed beaver dam. The other cool thing that beavers do that we don't talk enough about is they dig canals, right? They're really prodigious excavators, and they'll dig these kind of elaborate networks of canals that run up into the forest. So they can swim up those canals, cut down a tree, float it back down the canal, all without leaving the water. The canals are a really important way that they move water out on the landscape and get around. So, when you put it all together, here's a nice beaver complex. This is here in Colorado. This is probably about 12,000 feet or so in elevation up by the Continental Divide. So they really get way the heck up there. And you can just see, the stream kind of runs along. It's this nice, meandering sine wave. And then it hits all of these linear features here, these beaver dams. And, it spreads out in the canals. And this little complex is storing, hundreds of thousands of, if not millions of gallons of water in this valley and really hydrating that valley. And, basically acting like snowpack in some ways, right? Gradually, releasing that water in a trickle and keeping the Roaring Fork Valley hydrated throughout the year. So this, this kind of beaver water storage function is so important. We'll talk more about that in a minute. So beavers are what scientists know as a keystone species, right? Beavers, again, they're building dams to maximize their own food and shelter, but in so doing, they're creating these wetland habitats for all kinds of other creatures too, right? We know that water is life, and especially in the American West, every species is dependent on water. And it's hard to name an animal that doesn't benefit from these wet habitats that beavers create. A few examples. Here's a great blue heron rookery at a beaver complex in Wisconsin that I visited. So, right, wading birds, waterfowl, even songbirds, passerines will do really well, kind of foraging and perching and nesting in the coppiced willows around a beaver pond. So, I'm sure many of you are birders. Where do you go birding? You go to a wetland, right? And beavers create wetlands. Other semi-aquatic mammals, moose, muskrat, otter, mink, all very happy in beaver ponds. Here's a moose hanging out in a beaver pond in Utah. And then amphibians, obviously a huge beaver beneficiary. This is a boreal toad species that lives down in Colorado here. And, in much of their range, boreal toads are basically beaver pond obligates. They essentially only breed in beaver created habitats. And that's true of, plenty of amphibians in the Northwest as well. Here's one really cool sort of beaver habitat connection that I find amazing. This is in Minnesota. You can see here's an old beaver dam, right? At some point, the beavers left the area, or they were eaten or something less, they died of disease or something, right? And they didn't maintain this dam. So the dam breached, the pond drained. You get this nice, lush, wet meadow that's really good forage for deer and moose and elk and other animals. But what happened here that's really cool is you can see the old beaver lodge was kind of left high and dry. And a pack of wolves actually moved into that lodge and raised their pups in that lodge. So that's beavers creating habitat for their direct predator. I think that's pretty incredible. And then, of course, the species that you all care about so much in the Northwest, salmon. Obviously, if you're a juvenile salmon like this baby steelhead, you don't want to live in the fast-flowing main stem river, right? You want that gentle, slow water kind of refuge habitat where you can hang out in a meander or a side channel or an eddy or a pool and be safe and conserve your energy. And that's exactly what beavers create, right? Are those really good, juvenile salmon rearing grounds. And here's a little steelhead. Of course, one common objection that you've possibly heard is that, wait a second, we're trying to take dams out of rivers like the Elwha, right? We don't want to put more dams into rivers. Aren't beavers just going to, impede the passage of salmon? But of course, a beaver dam and a human-built concrete dam have very little in common. Beavers can, or the salmon can swim around beaver dams during periods of high flow when the water's out in the floodplain. They can actually wriggle through the structure. They can jump over the dam. Here's a dam, a little beaver pond. Again, this is on the peninsula somewhere. And I like this picture because here's the beaver dam. Here's the upstream side. And here are the two freshly excavated coho salmon redds or nests. So at least two fish had no problem whatsoever getting past this little beaver dam. And in fact, the evolutionary connection between beavers and salmon is so deep that it inspired my favorite bumper sticker, which is that beavers taught salmon to jump. I think that gets at the connection pretty nicely. So, today nobody really knows how many beavers live in North America. The best guess that we have is something like 10 to 15 million, right? Which sounds, pretty good. They're doing okay. They're not going to go extinct anytime soon. But that's obviously a tiny fraction, right, of how many beavers used to live in North America. We don't really know, but the best estimate we have is that there were as many as 400 million beavers on this continent prior to European arrival. All those beavers would have created as many as 250 million beaver ponds, and a little bit of back of the envelope math tells you that maybe there were 230,000 or so square miles impounded by beavers, which for reference is about the size of Arizona and Nevada put together. So this is once just an unbelievably prolific, ubiquitous animal that modified the landscape in just unbelievably profound ways. And I should point out, of course, that the understanding that beavers are this useful, valuable ecological engineer, is also many thousands of years old, right? This is not something that Western scientists made up. There were many tribes like the Blackfeet, for example, who venerated the beaver and considered the beaver sacred, and actually had cultural prohibitions against killing beavers because they recognized that, in the arid Western landscape, these were animals that created these incredible watering holes for, elk and bison and other game they hunted. So, this notion of beavers as kind of keystone species is a really ancient one, something that humans have understood for a very long time. And when you go back through old explorers journals and trappers diaries and railroad survey reports, this picture of this incredibly ubiquitous, powerful, influential animal really emerges. There are incredible accounts of explorers crossing what is today the state of Indiana and not finding a dry place to camp for 100 miles because beavers have just ponded everything up. Lewis and Clark talk about seeing beaver dams as far as the eye can see in every tributary of the Missouri River in Montana, up to the base of the mountains. So this was once just an incredibly powerful and again, abundant animal that just profoundly changed every landscape it touched. Again, there are accounts of trappers, finding these amazing lush marshes filled with waterfowl in Utah and eastern Wyoming, places that are desert today, thanks in large part to beavers. But of course, the fall of the beaver was as dramatic as its rise once was. Beavers were turned into hats, as you probably know, beginning in the early 1600s. The fur trade sort of begins in New England and spreads west and south across the continent. I think sometimes we hear the phrase beaver hat and maybe think of like a big fluffy, Davy Crockett type thing. But beaver hats were these elegant sort of Victorian style top hats that were all the rage back in Europe. And really, along with timber and cod, were the most important economic resource that white colonists found in the quote unquote New World. It's really hard to overstate the extent to which this rapacious demand for pelts drove early American history. Practically every significant event prior to the Civil War, from the American Revolution to the Louisiana Purchase, to the War of 1812, had some kind of beaver connection. Here's kind of a cool indication of that, I think. This is a beaver coin, which is minted by the Oregon Territory, which encompassed basically the entirety of the Northwest. And the value of one beaver coin was fixed to the value of one beaver pelt. So the entire currency of the Northwest operated under the pelt standard. And of course, it was those white fur trappers and traders who spread smallpox and other diseases that ravaged many native tribes. So the story of the fur trade is really kind of the story of early American history and all of its, grandiosity and tragedy. So in addition to being a hugely significant historic event, right, the fur trade was also this profound ecological event. I mean, what happens when you kill several 100 million beavers? Well, several 100 million beaver dams break down and drain to the ocean, right? And I mean, one incredible testament to how significant this event is the fact that in much of New England, the release of all of those nutrients from old beaver ponds fertilized these big algae blooms in places like the Long Island Sound. So today, you can take a sediment core in the ocean and find that layer of diatoms that was fertilized by the loss of beaver ponds. It's a kind of an incredible testament, I think, to what a significant event this was. I think we don't really think about fur trapping and trading in the same terms as we think about, the deforestation of New England, or, the damming of northwestern rivers, or, gold mining in the Sierra Nevada. We don't think about fur trapping as being this seminal ecological disaster, but there's no question it was, right? I mean, when you lose all of those beaver dams that are slowing water down and pushing water onto the floodplain and, creating those lush wetlands and wet meadows, when you lose those beaver built speed bumps, you often get this kind of catastrophic erosion and incision, and streams get kind of locked in their banks. And, these former lush wetlands basically dry out. And dramatically lose their productivity. I think we often see degraded streams like this and think, oh, that was probably due to overgrazing or mining or some other historic impact. But in many cases, that's due to the loss of beavers. I mean, this is a stream in Wyoming. This is in Yellowstone National Park, where there were no industrial impacts except for the elimination of beavers, and this is what you get. So, again, it's kind of hard to overstate, what an ecological catastrophe, this kind of aquatic dust bowl would have been for all kinds of creatures. Here's a coho salmon out in the peninsula, and I think in some ways, coho are the poster species for this issue, right? I mean, coho salmon, their juveniles spend more time in fresh water than other salmonids. They're really dependent on those refuge habitats, and there have been studies basically on the peninsula, basically showing that that the loss of beaver ponds, is part of this 97% loss of coho rearing habitat. So, again, I mean, the loss of beavers was this just profound ecological catastrophe. I think that we're still trying to wrap our heads around for coho and all kinds of other species. So, by 1900 or so, the beaver population has sort of reached its nadir. There are probably 100,000 or so left in North America, pretty much all up in Canada. They're, functionally extinct in most of their former range in the lower 48. But, fortunately, we start to wise up right around then. Enos Mills, a great naturalist, writes a wonderful beaver book that kind of turns the tide of public opinion. And, states start to reintroduce beavers, mostly using stock from Canada or from Yellowstone National Park, where a few survived. And, Washington, Oregon, California, all the West Coast states are reintroducing beavers. Probably the most famous beaver reintroduction, which, maybe you've heard of, occurred in Idaho. Where in 1948, biologists wanted to reintroduce beavers to what is today the Frank Church Wilderness. At first, they tried moving beavers on horseback. The horses did not take very kindly to having a big, smelly rodent hooked to their back, so the horses sort of put the kibosh on that. But, it's 1948, just post-World War II. There are a bunch of surplus airplanes and parachutes on hand, all of this military surplus. And one of these guys has the bright idea of putting beavers in these crates and actually parachuting them into the backcountry. So in 1948, they airdropped 76 beavers into the Frank Church Wilderness, or what's today the Frank Church. 75 of the beavers survived. One beaver, unfortunately, escaped from the crate in midair somehow and fell to his death. Very sad. But the next year, when they flew back over this area, they saw new ponds and wetlands and all of the places where they dropped beavers. So that was actually, a very successful kind of state-of-the-art project at the time. Nobody is airdropping beavers anymore, but that was how they did it in the 1940s. So all throughout the 20th century, we've got beaver populations recovering, right? They're being reintroduced. The great thing about beavers is that they're good at creating their own habitat, right? So they're kind of engineering the conditions where they can recover. But the problem is that, in their absence, we humans have really claimed a lot of the best habitat, right? I mean, good beaver habitat and good human habitat is kind of one and the same. We both like these nice, broad, fertile floodplains and low gradient streams. That's where beavers build their dams, and that's where we like to put our roads and our rail lines and our power lines and our towns and our farms and all of our infrastructure. And I'd argue that we're really the nuisance species more than they are. But there's no question that when beavers and humans overlap, the results can be messy. Here's a set of railroad tracks in Massachusetts. These tracks had just, when I visited them a few years ago, they'd just been sort of completed. It was this whole multi-million-dollar project, and within a month of their completion, beavers had them underwater. Here's a cabin in New Mexico that I came across a couple of years ago. I like this picture because what you can sort of see here is that the beavers begin their dam in the upper left corner of the screen. They dam up to the base of the cabin, then they incorporate the cabin in their dam, and they keep going on the other side. So, you wouldn't want to be that landowner, but you have to admire the ingenuity there. This is probably the most common form of beaver conflict, damming and road culverts, right? If you're a beaver, the road bed is like the world's greatest dam, and the culvert is the leak in the dam. And, beavers plug leaks. That's what they do. So the water level rises, the road washes out, very expensive to maintain, big headache. That's, again, probably the most common beaver conflict. But they do get into more sort of creative forms of trouble. Here's a beaver that broke into a dollar store in Maryland and was browsing the plastic Christmas tree rack when it was apprehended by the authorities. So that feels like a metaphor for something. So they get into all kinds of interesting trouble. The way that we almost always handle these sorts of conflicts is by trapping out the offending beaver, right? Every year, the federal government, the Department of Agriculture, kills around 20,000 beavers, private nuisance trappers, kill certainly tens and probably hundreds of thousands more. We don't really know, that makes a certain amount of intuitive sense, right? Beavers are causing a problem, get the beaver out of there. But the issues are several-fold. I mean, first, when you kill the beavers, you're also potentially eliminating that great pond and wetland habitat that we care about. And you're also just creating a kind of a vacancy for the next family of beavers, right? As long as that culvert is still there, attracting them, they're always going to come back. So all of these communities all over the country have, gotten into these very expensive and, I would argue inhumane and ecologically nonsensical cycles of trapping and recolonization and trapping and recolonization. You start to wonder, well, maybe there's a better way of solving some of these beaver conflicts. And here's a case study I really like. So lots of beavers get killed for cutting down trees, ornamental trees, fruit trees, what have you. And I just don't think that a beaver should ever be killed for cutting down a tree. That's just too easy a problem to solve with a bit of wire fencing. And here's a kind of a cool case study. I like this story. This is actually in the town that I live in now in Colorado, where the local land trust had this, these big, beautiful old cottonwoods at one of their properties they wanted to protect from beavers, which, okay, no problem. So they wrapped those cottonwoods in wire, and then they left unfenced the non-native Siberian elm tree, which the beavers took down. So that's invasive vegetation management using the beaver as your agent. I think that's pretty cool. When the problem is flooding, it's slightly easier or slightly harder to solve. But there too, we've got options. Here's a contraption called the Beaver Deceiver, which is probably, which is part of this kind of broader category of contraptions called flow devices. And they're all pretty simple. Basically the idea is that you're using a pipe to just, run water from the upstream side of the dam to the downstream side. The fences are there to kind of keep the beavers from plugging up the pipe, because they will if you give them a chance. Here's a kind of a very low-tech, basic one that I helped put in near Spokane last year. We can sort of see how it works. Here, again, you just run the pipe through the beaver dam. And here, you can see at this point, the pipe's been in for an hour probably. And, we've dropped 6 inches of water on along the trunks of these trees. And here, a landowner had called the group that I was part of because, beavers had kind of flooded her property and she couldn't access a lot of it. So, we just put in one of these devices and drop that water and, solve the flooding problem pretty easily. And, the beavers, they try to plug this thing up, but, you go back every few months, make sure it's still flowing and you're good to go. So again, these sorts of devices, not necessarily appropriate for every single beaver conflict, but certainly, they've been proven highly effective. Their studies have shown that they're sort of 87 to 97% effective in different situations. So no question, there are thousands and thousands of sites all over the country where we're currently trapping beavers over and over and over again, where we could be using these kinds of non-lethal techniques to coexist with them instead. Another great option, especially true in Washington, is beaver relocation. Basically live trapping nuisance beavers, mostly beavers on private property, and moving them up into headwaters on public land, places that would be hard for them to recolonize on their own because they're, way the heck up there. And there were lots and lots of projects in Washington moving beavers around. You've got the Methow Beaver Project in Winthrop, you've got the Tulalip tribe, you've got the Yakima, you've got the Lands Council, and the reason for that basically, without getting into the whole history of the politics, Washington has probably the best beaver relocation laws in the country. There are other states like California, which is, getting better, but still way behind Washington, where it's, almost functionally impossible to relocate a beaver. Whereas in Washington, we're really good about it, which is, valuable because you're both solving, or at least temporarily solving conflicts, and you're using those beavers to kind of reseed those drainages way up high in the headwaters, where we really want them storing water and kind of imitating that snowpack. So here's a kind of a standard beaver live trap called a Hancock trap. And here are two freshly captured beavers, Sandy and Chomper, about to get get moved to their new homes. This is up in the Methow, just outside of Winthrop, which that project has probably moved 500 or 600 beavers at this point, and really reestablished populations all over sort of northern Washington, which is fantastic. Obviously one challenge that beavers have, right, is that if you just take a couple of beavers and dump them out in the landscape, odds are good they'll get eaten by a cougar, right? They don't have that that lodge and that nice pond to protect them from predators. So a lot of projects now will kind of build these artificial lodges to keep them safe until they can build a better lodge of their own. And this is up in the Cascades. Where is this? This is sort of like near like Cedro Woolley kind of. And here's the beaver enjoying her new lodge, her new artificial lodge, before she can build a better one. Another cool technique that's being used a lot now in Washington and really all over the American West is the creation of beaver dam analogs, right? These kind of human-built beaver mimicry structures. And, there the idea is similar, right? You build a beaver, you sort of build this artificial beaver dam, you create a nice pond for them, and they're more likely to kind of stick around where you put them. So this is sort of like a kind of a human beaver collaboration, to restore streams that's being used in a lot of places for a lot of different reasons. It's a very low tech restoration technique. Obviously, broken fingers can be a hazard. But the place where this technique was really pioneered, the use of beaver dam analogs, was in Central Oregon on a stream called Bridge Creek, which is part of the kind of the Columbia River system. And there, so this stream, Bridge Creek, it did have beavers, but the beavers weren't doing super well. It was this very kind of simplified, single thread, degraded channel, impacted by many decades of beaver trapping and overgrazing. So here, scientists built 115 of these beaver dam analogs. The beavers, who again had been in the system, but weren't doing too hot. They kind of went gangbusters, built 120 dams of their own. As a result, the inundated area more than doubled, right? So you get beavers spreading water out onto the floodplain, filling in all of these historic side channels, and that created just fantastic habitat for these juvenile steelhead, which, in the Columbia Basin are listed as a threatened species. And scientists there actually saw that, that beaver dam analogs increased survival of these juvenile steelhead by about 50%. So that's humans and beavers kind of working together to dramatically increase the survival of an endangered species. I think that's kind of a pretty cool example of primate rodent partnership. And here's another kind of beaver dam analog that I was a part of building in, again, this is near Spokane, just kind of on a tributary of Newman Lake, if anybody knows Newman Lake. And this is just kind of a cool project because these, all of these ponderosa branches were from a kind of a local fuels reduction project at a park near Spokane. So, took the Lands Council, the group who kind of led this project, took those old, ponderosa branches that had been cut to reduce fire risk, and then incorporated them in a beaver dam analog. Kind of cool. So, we've been talking a lot about what beavers do for other species, how they benefit, salmon and amphibians and waterfowl. But what do beavers do for humans that we might care about? Not that that's the sole measure of a species, but it's a good argument to be able to make. What do beavers do for us, us humans? And a few things that I think are important. Obviously, they're fantastic agents of stream restoration and water storage, right? Here's kind of just a very famous in the beaver world kind of before and after picture. And this this was not. Beavers were not reintroduced to the stream. This is in Nevada. This is in kind of northeastern Nevada. This is just, the result of 100 years of overgrazing. So in the 1990s, the Bureau of Land Management and the ranchers kind of worked together to, improve grazing practices, let, the kind of riparian vegetation recover a little bit. Beavers just, sort of found their way back in there. They had this kind of magical way of finding an available food source, and that just really, transformed the area to an incredible extent. Stored a huge amount of water, created 20 acres of additional water. These beautiful, wonderful ponds and wetlands that they're known for. In this case, they actually added 3 miles of wetted stream length to this creek. So that's what does that mean? So before the return of beavers, this stream was so degraded that it was going dry before reaching its confluence with the main river, right? So by building dams and slowing water down, beavers ensured there would still be water in the stream, by August, September, the hot, dry season, right? So beavers basically took a seasonal stream and made it perennial. I think that's kind of miraculous. They also added 2 feet to the water table. So, in a beaver pond, there's all of this visible surface water that you see. But what you don't see is the weight of that surface water forcing water into the ground, hydrating the soil, recharging the aquifer, raising that water table. There's probably 5 to 10 times more water being stored under a beaver pond than in the pond itself as surface water. So that's a big deal because beavers are basically acting as irrigators, right? By raising that water table. And here, beavers added 100 acres of riparian vegetation to what was once this really kind of dry, lifeless valley. And that's a big deal for this guy. This is James Rogers. He's a rancher in Nevada who's, kind of worked with beavers. And, the point that he made to me is that beavers are basically increasing forage production for his livestock tenfold, right? Again, they're irrigating, they're creating this wonderful food resource for his cattle. So, in Northeast Nevada, this very kind of, conservative place, there's this wonderful cluster of pro-beaver ranchers who've experienced what these animals can do in a really arid climate. Another cool thing that beavers do is they're great at slowing down floods, right? So, wait a second, I think we often think that beavers cause flooding, and, maybe that's true on a very local scale, but on a larger scale, they prevent flooding, right? You get a big pulse of rainwater, racing down a stream, and then it hits those beaver ponds, and it spreads out laterally into the floodplain, or it's stored in the pond, or it sinks into the ground. There have been great studies basically showing that beavers capture about 30% of these big rainfall events. So here's a beaver complex in Scotland, where Eurasian beavers, kind of the close cousin to our North American beavers, are being reintroduced for their flood control benefits. So I think that's almost kind of worth pausing to reflect on, right? You've got these 2 polar opposite problems: drought on one side, flooding on the other side, these two kind of extreme events that are being exacerbated by climate change. And beavers can help us on both ends of the hydrograph by just kind of stabilizing those flows. I think that's almost kind of miraculous. Another great thing that beavers do is they're great at capturing pollution, right? You get the stream is running along, it's carrying its suspended nitrates and phosphates and heavy metals and fertilizer and and agricultural herbicides and pesticides, and then it hits that dam, the water slows down, and all of those suspended solids get they have a chance to just settle out and be entrained in many layers of sediment at the bottom of the beaver pond. They're also sequestering lots of carbon, right, for that same reason. Look at this, like this nice rich wedge of organic matter that kind of settles out behind a beaver dam over time. So they're just fantastic pollution control agents, and there have been lots of studies showing that. And then the final really cool beaver benefit that scientists are sort of studying now very actively and understanding more about all of the time is they're great firefighters, right? Obviously, water doesn't burn, and by spreading out water and turning those dry, brown, crispy plants into nice, lush, green, wet ones, beavers are creating these wonderful fire refugia and fire breaks on the landscape. And here's just an incredible illustration of that. This is the Sharps Fire in Idaho in, I think, 2017. And you can see that all of the uplands have been burnt to a crisp. And the last green, wet, blue, lush place is that beaver-influenced valley bottom. And just importantly, not all streams do this, right? You would think, well, I mean, obviously, water doesn't burn. Any stream is going to be a fire break. But that's actually not true. Streams with beavers are much more effective in this way because beavers are spreading the water out laterally, by building dams and digging canals. So, a stream, of course, all water doesn't burn, but streams with beavers in them are especially effective in this regard. So, given all these wonderful benefits, I mean, why do we still kill so many beavers? Why aren't they more universally embraced as kind of stream restoration tools and techniques? Why is the federal government still killing 20,000 of them every year? I think that part of it is that we've, when we eliminated 400 million beavers from the landscape, a couple centuries ago, we changed the land in ways that we don't necessarily even understand today. I think that we internalized a normal, healthy, natural stream as being this, free-flowing, fast-moving, cobble-bottom, single-thread, very simple channel, and in reality, I think, so many of our aquatic systems looked more like this. They were kind of messy. There were dead and dying trees everywhere. The water was flowing very, very slowly, if at all. The bottom was mucky. It all kind of smelled like decomposition, and this isn't necessarily a stream that you would see in, a river runs through it or something. But, I think that overwhelmingly these sorts of systems were more historic rule than exception. So if we're going to bring beavers back, we have to kind of reconfigure our historic imagination and I think that our problem is that because we don't understand what these systems look like, we see beaver whenever beavers show up, it's like they're wreaking havoc, right? They're causing problems, they're modifying the system, when in reality, they're just sort of returning it to the healthy, normal, natural state that it existed in, prior to industrial beaver trapping. So, to sum it all up, we've got this fabulous animal. It provides all of these wonderful ecological services for both other species and for humans. It does it all for free, and best of all, it doesn't need permits. That's really nice too. So let's step back, and the mantra of the Beaver Believer goes, "Let the rodent do the work." So with that, I'll say thank you guys so much. I think we've got time for some questions, right, Dave? I did write a book about all this stuff. If you leave tonight hungry for even more beaver knowledge and content, and thank you so much. And let's take some questions.
I love it, Ben. That was awesome. That was just such a great presentation. And I love your last slide. Any damn questions here? So this is perfect. You went through a lot of information really quick. So please do put in your questions in the chat. And I'm sure there will be lots of them here for Ben. We also have Lawrence Reeves, our conservation director here at the Capitol Land Trust, is going to be joining in for this Q&A here. So thanks, Lawrence. Welcome in. I know as Ben, you were presenting there was a ton I was learning there, and I was reading through the chat, and Bob Russell asked or said, made a statement, your hair is grown. And I thought for a second, oh, wow, my hair's growing. This is pretty awesome. And then I realized he was talking about you. And I got depressed really quickly. But I was wondering, Ben, what was your first, like, where did you kind of develop this love of beavers? What was kind of that first moment where you're like, I'm going to go deep on this subject?
Yeah, they just came to me in a dream one night. No, I don't know. I grew up in New York. Spent a lot in the Hudson Valley. Spent a lot of time, hiking, camping, fishing in the Catskills and the Adirondacks. Very beavery places. So I was always kind of around them. Enjoyed them. But then it was actually in 2014, I think I was living in Seattle, working for the magazine High Country News, which some of you probably know. Looking for things to write about, and then somebody sent me kind of a flyer for a beaver workshop up in Everett, and I didn't know what a beaver workshop entailed, but I knew it sounded cool, and it was just sort of like one scientist after another saying their piece about why beavers are so, all the stuff we just talked about, why they're such important creatures, and I think that was the moment when Morpheus handed me the red pill, and I realized that these aren't just cute fun rodents. These are really the kind of the primary movers and shakers in North American ecosystems.
That's cool. That's really cool. It's just neat I really appreciate you sharing all of your knowledge here. We've got some good questions in the chat box. One of the first questions that came in was, and you talked about this a little bit, but do coyotes kill and eat beavers? Yeah,
they'll take an adult beaver would be a pretty big meal for a coyote, but they'll take a kit for sure, and they definitely do.
Okay. Another question maybe is getting answered in here, but there was a question, and I'm sure others are interested. They'd love to hear your book title again, Ben. So do another plug for your book here.
Oh, sure. Yeah, it's called Eager, as an eager beaver. Eager, the surprising secret life of beavers and why they matter. The subtitle is kind of a mouthful, but that was what the publisher gave me. So I'll type it in the chat.
Yeah, and Allison just put a JPEG of the cover in there in the chat box too. So another question here is, let me see, it says to shade riparian corridors for salmon and to quell invasive reed canary grass, Capital Land Trust does creekside tree plantings. Other than fencing, which becomes choked with reed canary grass, do you have any creative suggestions for minimizing beavers munching these future sources of shade?
Yeah, good question. So there's a good recipe out there. It's on. I'll put this in the chat too. Check out the Beaver Institute. And they've got a cool recipe for basically this abrasive sand-based paint where you kind of mix latex paint and sand, and that creates this kind of this substance that beavers don't like chewing on. And I know that a lot of communities have had success, painting the trunks of trees with this stuff, and it's noticeable, but it's pretty unobtrusive, not a huge aesthetic impact, and it's pretty effective. So check out the Beaver Institute. That's got a good recipe for that stuff.
And then, are you aware of any native tree species that beavers dislike?
Man, that's tough. They'll definitely. They've got their favorites, right? So I wouldn't like nothing in the poplar family if your goal is to avoid beaver chewing, but there's really nothing that they won't take in a pinch. I would say definitely they've got a very, very strong preference for deciduous trees over conifers. So something coniferous that's not red cedar, because they do take that sometimes.
Okay. And then there's another question. Jane here is asking, how do beavers move the mud? Is it with their mouth, their paws, or their tail?
Yeah, they use their little paws. It's very cute. There are some good YouTube videos out there. If you like search for like beavers moving mud or beavers moving rock, you'll see good videos of them kind of like tottering along on their hind feet while carrying material in their hands. It's pretty sweet.
That's cool. And then Vanessa asks, is curious if there's any pro beaver bills or legislation that you're aware of that the public could support.
Yeah, totally. So there is Man, so there's a bill being, I don't know if this is public knowledge yet, or if this is about to happen, but there is a bill whose acronym is DAMS. It's like, I forget what the acronym is, but it's a bill being introduced by, and again, I can't believe I'm forgetting who the congresswoman in Washington is, but it would basically provide federal funding for non-lethal beaver conflict mitigation. Let me see if I can just find that super quick, because now this is it's the answer to the question. But yeah, that bill is being introduced. I think in an upcoming legislative session. So that's exciting. California's got a big sort of beaver program now, which they just created. But yeah, again, Washington, we're just very fortunate to have this fantastic beaver law in the books, the Beaver bill. And one cool story about the Beaver bill, which sort of authorized beaver relocation in Washington, is that the guy who actually passed that was Joel Kretz, who's representative for northeastern Washington. He's a very, very conservative rancher. He was the guy who introduced the bill that would have reintroduced wolves to Bainbridge Island, kind of as a middle finger to Western Washingtonians. So guy hates wolves, but he loves beavers because he's a rancher, and ranchers tend to like beavers. So he was actually the guy who authored the Beaver bill in Washington. So it's kind of cool how bipartisan these animals can be.
Oh, that is cool. That's very cool. How long do beavers live?
In the wild, 12 would be a pretty old beaver. I think the oldest known in captivity, I want to say, is 19.
Okay. We've got a lot of questions coming in here, and time for a few more. How do river otters coexist with beavers, and how do their practices contrast?
Well, yeah, I mean, they contrast in that, obviously beavers are herbivorous rodents, and otters are fish-eating mustelids. I would say that they coexist well in that beavers create really good otter habitat, right? Beavers basically build fish ponds for otters, but beavers don't love having the otters around, because otters have been known to kill beaver kits. That does happen. Whereas beavers really like muskrats, and muskrats will actually cohabitate in the lodge with beavers sometimes.
Interesting. And then, how did beavers get to North America was another question here.
Yeah, so let's see. I'll do some really, really quick evolutionary history. They evolved in North America in the Miocene about 30 million years ago in a very different form. There were all kinds of different sort of species of beavers tens of millions of years ago. There were like little prairie dog beavers that dug these big sort of helix-shaped burrows. They're sort of like these weird prairie dog colonial beavers. They basically became semi-aquatic, maybe 20 million years ago or so. They actually crossed the Bering Land Bridge into Europe and Asia, evolved into more or less their current form, and then recrossed about 8 million years ago. So they've kind of gone back and forth over the years, but they're originally in North America, evolved on the other side of the land bridge, and then returned.
Okay. That's amazing. Really good job answering that question quickly. Another question here is, are there funds to help farmers keep culverts open that beavers dam up, resulting in road flooding?
Yeah, I mean, different. None that I'm aware of in Washington. There are some. A few different states have had programs that basically do that. Montana, I know, has a program like that. Colorado has something kind of similar to that. But yeah, to my knowledge, there's nothing really in yeah, I'm not sure. I don't think there are any private funds. I mean, I would say that in your guys' neck of the woods, Beavers Northwest is really the group that does a lot of the kind of like the non-lethal beaver conflict resolution when it comes to those sorts of culvert devices. So check out Beavers Northwest, and then if you're looking for somebody to relocate a beaver, to live trap it off of your property and move it, the Tulalip tribe, their beaver program is probably the most active one in your area. So check out Beavers Northwest and the Tulalip Beaver Project.
Okay. Wow, this is great. A lot of good information and lots of good questions coming in here, but we are coming up on the time for the program tonight, and we're going to be respectful of everyone's time and try to finish on time. So Ben, really thank you for joining us today, doing this presentation, taking time to answer questions, sharing stories. This was a really fascinating presentation. And I would like to actually invite our membership engagement manager, Allison Baglin, onto the screen here to close us out this afternoon.
Hey, thanks, Dave. And thank you, Ben, so much for this just great presentation and all of this beaver information. And tonight, everyone, I just wanted to give you the opportunity to donate and to help conserve habitat for beavers and other wildlife. So if you were just inspired by the presentation that Ben gave tonight and you want to be a part of our mission to protect local lands and waters, please consider giving a gift to Capital Land Trust. Every gift matters. There's no gift that's too small.